Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over chapters 23 and 24 of J.D. Salinger's classic, The Catcher in the Rye. Well, we're getting close to the end, and how is this thing gonna end? I don't know. Let's find out together. All right. Let's begin chapter 23. Chapter 23 starts out with Holden making a phone call to Mr. Antolini. He said that he must have woken him up and his wife because it took a hell of a long time for him to answer the phone. The first thing his previous teacher asked him is if everything was okay, to which Holden just says yes, but he needed Mr. Antolini to someplace to spend the night. Mr. Antolini said, "Oh, good God, that's it." Holden mentions that this teacher was the best teacher he's ever had. Holden also mentions that he was pretty young and not much older than DB, and he was someone that you could horse around with without losing respect for. Holden also says this teacher was the very first teacher to went over and check on James Castle when he fell out of the window. He checked his pulse, took his coat off, and put his coat over James and carried him to the infirmary. Holden says that once he got back into the room, Phoebe had turned the radio on and the dance music was coming out of the radio. Holden mentions that it was very quiet so that the maid wouldn't wake up. Holden enters the room and finds her sitting on the bed with her legs crossed, just listening to the music. Holden then asks her if she would like to dance, and she gets off the bed and joins him. Holden said she's actually a really good dancer, and that he taught her a few moves when she was really little, but she really learned a lot on her own. He also says he thinks it's kind of depressing when older people dance with their children, but this instant was different because it's in the privacy of their own home. He also mentions that no matter what type of dance you do, Phoebe could really keep up with you. He says they danced for 4 numbers, and then after that he turns the radio off and sits down out of breath. Phoebe goes over to sitting back on the bed, and Phoebe asks him to feel her forehead to see if she is warm. On the first go around, Holden says no, but then Phoebe talks about how he needs to try again. So he does, and this time to humor her, he goes, "Ah, you are getting warmer." Phoebe says that's because a friend taught her how to increase her temperature and burn people. Holden thinks it's really funny, and he doesn't say anything to her about how that's impossible. But he does play along with her and pulls his hand away really fast and says, "Well, I'm glad you didn't burn me." And she says, "Oh, don't worry, I wouldn't have burned you anyway." But then she tells him to be quiet because she can hear something. He notices the front door is unlocking and opening. So Holden grabs all of his stuff and heads for the closet as Phoebe's trying to scramble to turn the lights off and jump back into bed. Their mother calls out to Phoebe and says, "I saw the light, young lady," to which she makes up an excuse that she couldn't sleep and asks her mom if she had a good time at the party, to which her mother responds, "Oh, I had a marvelous time," and Phoebe can tell that that's not particularly true. Their mother then asks why she was awake and if she was warm enough. Phoebe answers and says, "Yes, I'm warm enough, I just couldn't sleep." Phoebe's mother comes into the room and asks if she was smoking because she can smell the smoke. Phoebe makes up a lie and says, "Oh, I just lit one for 1 second and I opened the window, took one puff and then threw them out." Phoebe tries to rush this conversation to get her mother out of the room. However, her mother wants to ask about her day, how the movie was, and all these other things. Her mother asks about the movie and about dinner, to which Phoebe responds the movie was okay, but her friend's mother kept talking through the most important parts, and that dinner was okay as well, but the maid kept breathing all over her when she presented the food, which really annoyed her. After this, the mother exits to get ready for bed, and Phoebe waits until the coast is clear. It's still dark, and after a few moments, Holden comes out of the closet when he realizes that it's safe. They then stumble into each other, and Holden says that he needs to go. Phoebe begs him not to go just yet and wait until both of the parents are asleep. Holden says no, now is the perfect time because Dad will have the news on and Mom will be in the bathroom so they won't be able to hear him. Holden sits on the bed and begins to tie his shoes to get ready to leave. As he's doing this, he asks Phoebe if she has any extra money that he could borrow because he was running low, to which Phoebe said that she had a few dollars of Christmas money that she'd saved up. Holden doesn't want to borrow it because he wants to make sure she has money for Christmas presents, but she's already rummaging through the drawers anyway to find it for him. After a little bit, she comes over to Holden and hands the wad of cash to him. He's surprised by how much money there is, and he asks her how much is it, to which she responds $8.85. Or, well, $8.65 because she spent some a little bit earlier. He finally then takes the money after a long time because she asks him to. He says he finishes buttoning his coat and gets ready, and Phoebe asks if he'll be in touch soon and if he's going to see the play on Friday, to which Holden responds that he's going to see the play and that he wouldn't miss it for the world. She asks where he's going, and he says he'll probably stay with Mr. Antolini until Tuesday, that they're waiting for him. Then he takes his hunting hat out of his pocket and gives it to her because she really likes crazy hats. Holden then mentions to the reader that it was a hell of a lot easier getting out of the house than getting in. He said he thinks for one thing is that he didn't really give a damn anymore if his parents caught him, and he says that he almost wished they kind of did in one way. He then says he walks down the stairs instead of taking the elevator and goes down the back stairwell. He says he nearly breaks his neck on about 10 million garbage cans, but he gets out. He even says the elevator boy didn't see him and thinks that he he's probably still up with the Dickensteins. This is where chapter 23 ends. Now let's dive into chapter 24. This chapter starts out with Holden going to Mr. and Mrs. Antolini's apartment. Holden says that he's been there several times after he left Elkton Hills. Holden says that his family knew Mr. Antolini very well because he would come over for dinners at their house quite frequently, just to see how Holden was doing. Holden mentions that at this point he wasn't married yet, but then when he got married, he used to play tennis with Mr. Antolini's wife quite frequently while they were at West Side Tennis Club in Forest Hills, Long Island. Holden says that Miss Antolini was lousy with money, and she was about 60 years older than Mr. Antolini, but they seemed to get along quite well. He said they were both very intellectual people, especially Mr. Antolini, except that he was more witty than intellectual. When you were with him, he was sort of like DB. And Mrs. Antolini was mostly serious, and she had asthma pretty bad. Holden says that he would have walked to their place because he didn't want to spend any of Phoebe's Christmas money, but he felt funny when he went outside, sort of dizzy, so he took a cab, and he had kind of a hard time trying to find one. Holden says that Mr. Antolini answers the door when he rings the bell after the elevator boy finally lets him up. He also said that he had on his bathrobe and slippers, and he had a highball in one hand. Holden says that he was a very heavy drinker, Mr. Antolini, and then he greets him and states that he's grown another 20 inches since he's last seen him. They make a little bit of small talk, and Mr. Antolini grabs his coat and puts it in the closet. He then yells back to his wife, Lillian, and asks if the coffee is ready. She yells back that she says hello to Holden. Holden said it was funny because they often yell at each other in their apartment because they're not in the same room. Mr. Antolini then told him to go sit down and forgive the mess because they had just entertained some guests from Buffalo, some friends of Mrs. Antolini. At that moment, Holden goes to sit down and Mrs. Antolini yells something from the kitchen, but he can't quite hear what it is, so he asks for clarification. Mr. Antolini says that she says don't look at her when she comes in because she just got out of bed. Mr. Antolini then offers him a cigarette and asks if he's smoking. Holden says thank you and takes a cigarette from the box and tells him, I'm just a moderate smoker. Mr. Antolini then states that Holden is seeing anyone or not, and he asks what the trouble was and how Holden was doing in English. He jokes and says that he'll show Holden the door if he was to find out that he didn't pass his English class. Holden says he passed English because it was mostly literature and they only had to write 1 or 2 compositions the whole term. He did say that he flunked oral expression though because he didn't like it. Mr. Antolini asks why, and Holden goes on to explain about the class and how the structure was. He tells Mr. Antolini that essentially oral expression was a speech class and the boys had to stick to the topics that they were talking about, and if they were to divert, everyone in the class had to yell digression as fast as they could. Holden hates this, and that's why he got an F. Holden goes on to talk to Mr. Antolini and states that he doesn't mind when people digress about different subjects because to him that makes the story more interesting. He also says that the only boys who ever did good in oral expressions were the ones who would stick straight to the point and just very straightforward storytelling. Holden goes on to say that one kid in his class named Richard Kinsella actually he liked listening to, even though he was very nervous to start. But once he got onto his subject, he was really passionate about it. However, the other boys in the class would yell digression, because when he was supposed to talk about one subject, he would always go on to another. Holden says that he didn't mind though, and gave an example about how one speech Richard made was supposed to be about his father and the farm that he had, but he ended up telling a story about his uncle having polio, and how he didn't want to see anyone. Mr. Antolini then begins to speak and asks if Holden thinks there's a time and place for everything, and that if someone starts out and tells him about one subject, shouldn't he stick to his guns and then get around to the other story? Also, that if someone knows of a story more interesting, why not start with that one and then lead with the other one? At this point, Holden tells the reader that he didn't like thinking very much and answering, and that he also had a headache at this moment and felt really lousy, and he also was having a stomach ache. Holden also goes on to talk about the teacher of the oral expression class called Mr. Venison, and how, though he was very intelligent, he didn't have much brains. At this moment, Mrs. Antolini comes in with coffee and cakes and all the fixings. Holden goes on to say hello and starts to get up and help Mrs. Antolini, but Mr. Antolini pulls him back down and it makes him sick. Holden does not mention that Mrs. Antolini's hair was full of iron curlers and she didn't have any lipstick on or anything else. He also mentions she looks pretty old at this moment. And she tells the boys that she'll just leave everything here and the two of them can dive in, and she also asks Holden how his mother's doing, to which he responds that she's fine and that he hasn't seen her too recently. Mrs. Antolini interjects and tells her husband that if Holden needs anything else, go in the linen closet on the top shelf, and she's going to go to bed because she's exhausted. She then asks the boys if they can make the couch by themselves, to which Mr. Antolini says they can take care of everything and for her to just run back to bed. Holden then says that he gives her a kiss and says goodbye, and then goes into the bedroom. Holden drinks part of a cup of coffee and has about half of the cake, but Mr. Antolini just has another highball, and Holden mentions that he makes himself very strong drinks, and he should be careful because he'll become an alcoholic very quickly. Mr. Antolini then tells Holden that he had lunch with Holden's father not too long ago, and asks Holden if he knows about this, to which Holden says he was unaware. Mr. Antolini says that Holden's dad is really concerned about him, and that he had received a very harrowing letter from the headmaster of Pensy concerning Holden and the fact that he was cutting classes and coming unprepared. Holden interrupts that he didn't cut classes because you weren't allowed to at Pensy. He said he didn't attend every one of his classes every once in a while, but he never cut class. Holden mentions the coffee makes his system feel a little bit better, but he still had an awful headache, and that Mr. Antolini lights another cigarette. Mr. Antolini says that frankly he doesn't know what the hell to say to Holden. He says he has a feeling that he's on a ride of some kind of terrible fall, but honestly he doesn't know what kind. They have a very long conversation about what Holden will possibly be like in the future and how he'll end up hating everyone because of the ideas that he thinks about them, or judges people based off of their looks and their demeanor. Holden says that he really didn't hate anyone, and he goes on to mention Stradlater and Ackley, and how after a couple of meals or after a couple of days of not seeing them, he would actually begin to miss them. Mr. Antolini didn't say anything to this, but instead gets up and gets another piece of ice for his drink, and then sits back down. Mr. Antolini then begins to speak and states that this fall he thinks Holden is on is a special kind of horrible fall. It's one that the man falling isn't permitted to feel or hear. He just keeps falling and falling. The whole arrangement's designed for men who at some point or other in their lives end up looking for something their own environment couldn't supply them with, or they thought their own environment couldn't supply it with them. So they give up looking. They gave up before they ever really got started. He then gets up and pours more booze into his glass and sits back down, and he didn't say anything for quite a while. He tells Holden that he doesn't want to scare him, but he can see Holden clearly dying nobly one way or another for some highly unworthy cause. He then says, "If I write you something down, will you read it carefully and keep it?" Holden says, "Of course," and mentions to the reader that he still has a paper that Mr. Antolini wrote him from a little while ago. So, Mr. Antolini goes over to the desk and begins to write on a piece of paper and brings it back to Holden. He states that oddly enough, what he had written was not by a practicing poet, but instead a psychoanalyst named Wilhelm Steckel. Mr. Antolini quotes the expression, "The mark of an immature man is that he wants to die nobly for a cause, while the mark of a mature man is that he wants to live humbly for one." After this, Holden tells the reader that he feels really tired, but he puts the piece of paper in his pocket. Holden mentions that Mr. Antolini wasn't tired at all, and was actually getting pretty oiled up. Mr. Antolini then says that he thinks that one of these days Holden is going to have to find out where he wants to go, and then he's going to start going there. But immediately he has to go because he can't afford to lose another minute. Mr. Antolini also says that he hates telling Holden this, but once he has a fair idea of where he wants to go, his first move will be to apply himself in school. He says that Holden's a student whether the idea appeals to him or not. He says that Holden has a certain level of knowledge, and he thinks that he'll find out once he gets past the Mr. Vincents, and he'll start getting closer and closer to finding out what he really wants to know. Mr. Antolini says that one thing Holden will find out is that Holden is not the first person who has ever been confused and frightened and even sickened by human behavior, and that Holden is no means alone in his train of thought. Mr. Antolini also says that some of these people kept records of their troubles, and that Holden will learn from them if he wants to. He also says that people have something to offer. Someone will learn something from you, and it's beautiful in its reciprocal arrangement. He then stops and takes another big drink out of his highball. He says, "I'm not going to try to tell you your only educated and scholarly men are able to contribute something valuable to the world. It's not so, but he does say that educated and scholarly men, if they're brilliant and creative, which unfortunately is a rare case, tend to leave infinitely more valuable records behind them than men who are merely brilliant and creative. They tend to express themselves more clearly, and they usually have a passion for following their thoughts through to the end. And 9 times out of 10 they have more humility than the unscholarly thinker." Holden, trying to keep back from yawning as he's talking to Mr. Antolini, then goes to tell Holden that pretty soon he'll find the size of his mind, and what thoughts he can and cannot entertain inside of them. After saying this, Holden then yawns instinctively. Mr. Antolini just laughs, and they get up and fix the couch for Holden. Holden mentions that as Mr. Antolini is trying to reach everything in the closet, he still has the highball in his hand and can't reach it with the glass. So, he downs his drink, puts it on the ground, and then takes everything off the top shelf. They begin to make his bed, and Mr. Antolini asks about the women in Holden's life, but Holden is so sleepy he can barely answer. He also mentions how Mr. Antolini is terrible at making beds, but it's okay because he literally could have slept standing up. Holden mentions that him and Sally Hayes actually had a date earlier this afternoon, and that he mentioned to the reader it seemed like almost 20 years ago. But he tells Mr. Antolini that him and Sally Hayes really don't have anything in common anymore, and in fact, he's thinking about ringing Jane Gallagher tomorrow to see what she's doing. After this, and the bed has been made, Mr. Antolini then says to Holden, "Do you know where the bathroom is? And if you need to use it, go ahead and use it. He'll be in the kitchen drinking his highball." Holden gets undressed in the bathroom and makes his way back to the couch. Mr. Antolini tells him good night, handsome, and then walks back to the kitchen. Holden tells the reader he would have brushed his teeth had he had a toothbrush, but he doesn't, so he goes to lay down on the couch, which is too short for him. He only keeps his eyes open for just a few minutes, but then closes them. Holden goes on to say that he awakes up instantly when he feels something on top of his head, and this really scares him. When he wakes up, he realized that Mr. Antolini's hand was on his head, and that Mr. Antolini was sitting on the floor right next to Holden, petting him. So Holden quickly gets up to his feet. Holden asks Mr. Antolini what he's doing, and Mr. Antolini replies with nothing. He's simply sitting there admiring Holden, and he tells Holden, "Don't raise your voice," and Mr. Antolini asks him to keep it down. As Holden is getting up, he's very nervous and begins to put on his pants and clothes in the dark. Holden goes on to tell the reader that he knows more perverts at school than anybody else he's ever met, and they're always being pervy when he's around. When Holden tells Mr. Antolini that he needs to go somewhere, Mr. Antolini responds with, "Where?" And Holden mentions that Mr. Antolini is trying to act very casual in this moment. Holden responds that he left his bags at the train station earlier and he better go down and get them because all of his stuff was in them. Mr. Antolini responds and says, "They'll be there in the morning, I'll go back to bed," and that he's going to go to bed very soon. He also asks what's the matter with Holden, to which Holden responds nothing, it's just the bags. He had all of his money in it and stuff in it, and so he'll be right back. Holden says he'll grab a cab, get his stuff, and be right back to the apartment. Holden tells the reader that he was practically falling all over himself in the dark trying to get dressed and get out of there. He also tells Mr. Antolini that the money isn't his, it's his mother's. But Mr. Antolini interrupts and says, "Don't be ridiculous, Holden, get back to bed," and that he's going to be back to bed soon and the money will be safe and sound in the morning. Holden then tries to conversate with Mr. Antolini and rushing through the conversation telling him that he's got to go. Holden mentions that now Mr. Antolini is getting up and sitting in the chair in the living room, and even though it was dark inside the room, he could tell Mr. Antolini was watching him very intently. He could also tell that he was still boozing very heavily because he could see the highball glass in his hand. Mr. Antolini said that Holden was a very strange boy, and Holden agrees. Holden said that he couldn't find his tie and was starting to get nervous. However, he just forgets about it and goes to the front door. He says goodbye and thanks Mr. Antolini for everything that he's done. Mr. Antolini keeps walking behind Holden though as he's going to the front door, and as Holden is ringing the elevator bell, Mr. Antolini is still standing in the doorway. As Holden was waiting for the elevator, he tells Mr. Antolini that he's going to start reading some good books, and Holden then mentions that it was just kind of weird and awkward with Mr. Antolini standing in the door and him waiting for the elevator, which seemed to take forever to get there. Mr. Antolini tells him, "Go grab your bags and hurry right back on here," because he'll leave the door unlatched for him. Holden says thank you and goodbye, and the elevator finally gets there and he gets in and goes down. Holden was still shaking like a madman and sweating as he was leaving. Holden then mentions to the reader that when something pervy happens to him, he always begins to sweat like a bastard. He also says that kind of stuff happens to him a lot and has happened to him about 20 times since he was a kid, and he can't stand it. This is where chapter 24 ends. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, stay lit.